How's it going, Prince? A very good evening to you all, and welcome to episode number 12 of the Logbook, where today we're going to explore a series of content that will be useful for the project I'm developing, which, as I've said, I want to share with you, and which is also the result of our research. Let's get started with today's program. A scientist named Ugo, I'll write it down here, Ugo Ferlini, was an Italian scientist from the mid-19th century approximately. This man designed and conducted an experiment that essentially involved the following. First, he carefully positioned a magnetic field, a magnet, against another. A magnet against another with the same polarity. For example, you put north against north. Here we would have south against south, all right? And as he brought them closer together, trying in some way to provoke the repulsion effect, obviously the closer he got, the stronger the magnetic field's repulsion became. Depending on the strength of each field, it became practically impossible to join them. You've probably done that experiment yourself since you were little, when you try playing with magnetic fields. So what he actually did was carefully set up a sturdy stand, where he would then fix these magnets securely in place, using a very small worm screw. Positioned on each side of the magnet, so that with a crank, which we'll draw here in another color, that's the crank, he could carefully adjust the position of the magnets, either closer together or further apart by millimeters along that screw, towards the center where those repulsive forces were, right? Up to that point, everything was perfectly fine and easy to understand. But here, Ferlini noticed a very peculiar effect, which is what he called. At the very beginning of his observation, what he actually witnessed was a mist, remarkably similar in appearance to what you see when the tarmac is completely overwhelmed and stifled, as one might say, by the intense radiating heat of a summer storm itself. And that little haze rises up and distorts the light, so everything you see becomes quite a bit more blurry and indistinct through it. So far, so good, right? Understandable. Initially, as I say, he saw a kind of mist when he reached a certain point that he called the 0 point of approach between the magnets. Since the fog was very short or very small, he decided to increase the capacity of the magnetic fields. First, he placed stronger magnets, and then he placed two more magnets facing each other, creating a larger frame, and he placed another two magnets here, facing each other. Again with north and north polarity, so that the center was exactly, of course, with the worm screws and their respective handles, and here as well, though it doesn't sit for me. There was a converging point where all the magnetic fields came together. He called this the magnetic 0 point, or precisely the void. And he referred to the theoretical concept of this specific point as what he termed the magnetic barrier. This can be done with 4 magnets. It can be done with 6. A hexagonal arrangement is excellent, like the hexagram of Solomon's seal. And from here, concepts start to be woven together. It can be done with 8, as they do with sound, because, as I said, this is a being in miniature. From this point, he began to observe certain phenomena. We're not going to focus on all of them, but one of the things he said was that this magnetic barrier, the definition he initially gave is, this phenomenon is a complex spatial zone of distortion that is actively generated by the intricate magnetic interaction of various magnetic fields. As we have already mentioned in our previous discussion regarding these physical principles, this specific area represents a significant disruption in the surrounding environment. The question is, of course, those magnetic fields are of very high frequency because he's bringing them as close as possible and increasing their power. That was the definition Ferlini gave for his magnetic barrier when he observed that mist phenomenon appearing right in the center. I was telling you that he went from using 2 magnets facing each other to 4 magnets. That's as far as he got, right, to increase the density of the electromagnetic field. He was specifically referring to the magnetic field, which makes sense because he was extensively working with powerful magnets during that period. Up to that particular point in time, you were already quite well aware of these specific developments, weren't you? Another fascinating interpretation that Ferlini provided was his bold claim that when several different magnetic sources converged precisely at a single point, a unique and mysterious zone was created there, which he referred to as the 0 point. 0 point zone, or a local vacuum. I will give you a serious heads up right now. At that specific point in time, what the scientists at CERN are apparently looking for is antimatter, mysterious dark matter. Please remember that word dark, the elusive God particle, also known as the Higgs boson, all right? It is a massive undertaking for everyone involved. In this local vacuum, he also claimed that where the fundamental laws of conventional physics, the specific ones known up to that point, and which we still recognize today, now commonly referred to as quantum physics, but they are suspended momentarily or temporarily. This man carried out a series of experiments encountering that magnetic barrier as he went, by turning that endless screw until he found the optimal 0 point opposition of the magnet. That mist would appear, which is very similar to a circuit in resonance, and he began to offer this series of interpretations of his experiment. At the exact moment when the mysterious mist first appeared, a phenomenon which he specifically referred to as the mist effect, he explained in great detail that the mist Ferlini observed is actually a complex process involving the ionization of energy within the surrounding vacuum of space. The magnetic fields are incredibly and immensely powerful, so it's not just that they undergo a significant distortion. The distortion and the mist manifest themselves because the atoms that exist in this space at a molecular level are literally dissociated by the strength of the magnetic field. That is to say, it's a field so intense, the one generated at the intersection of those 4 points from a magnetic point of view, that it causes the electrons not to remain in their orbits. So the physical matter as we currently understand it completely dissociates. Or in other words, we have a vacuum, essentially hollow matter. He firmly believed and theorized that this mysterious ethereal mist represented a complex transitional intermediate state existing between our physical matter and the vast energy of space, but in a disassociated form. This is a concept which nowadays the world-renowned scientists, for example those working at the CERN laboratory, identify as antimatter or the elusive dark matter, which are fundamental components of our modern understanding of the universe. Apparently, the term dark comes from the fact that there is an absence of light and everything we know. However, keep in mind this idea of dark and the dark ones, because apparently that's where they are. It's not that they're there as if it were another place. They're in the same place, but at a different vibrational frequency. There are even more comprehensive interpretations and analyses made by Ferlini, because it is absolutely vital that we fully understand this from this specific point forward in our study. Ferlini clearly stated that under the specific effects of the magnetic barrier, physical matter itself, as we have already previously mentioned, appears dissociated or disorganized. And the explanation is, imagine a piece of cardboard made up of millions of carbon atoms. Each atom has at least electrons in its orbits. The magnetic field is so powerful that the molecules, in this case of cardboard or air, that are at that geometric center point, what happens is that they jump between orbits. They can't find a balance and appear disassociated. The matter can't remain cohesive. That's why we talk about dissociation, and the reason is the powerful magnetic field. So powerful. In fact, what happens here is, because we know that matter cannot be destroyed, it's energy after all, What happens is that its resonance frequency changes. And now we're introducing the term resonance frequency a bit by. That is, the same thing is there, but it's vibrating at a different resonance frequency. Therefore, it might not even be visible to us. Another interpretation by Ferlini, and this is the last one. The researcher known as Hugo Ferlini once claimed that within the confines of that specific magnetic barrier, any physical object, virtually any object, including complex structures and fundamental atoms, could be completely transformed or affected by the field. Can be launched or accelerated to extraordinarily high velocities. When we talk about the specific term incredible speed within the field of physics, we are referring to speeds approaching the universal speed limit of light. If I were to specifically mention in this context the acceleration of objects or particles, do you see the direct and clear connection with something like, for instance, a particle accelerator? This happened, Ferlini said, because the object was no longer rubbing against the fabric of our dimension, but instead appeared disassociated. So, since there is no friction, let's say, it can move at extremely high speed. And finally, to understand or move on to the next topic, he suggested that the magnetic barrier is like a thin membrane positioned right between all of our ordinary matter and mysterious antimatter, or even invisible dark matter. From here, from the concept of a membrane, window, or door, is where the term interdimensional portal comes from. It's not a door between dimensions. It's about altering the frequency state in order to manifest what exists in the same dimension, but vibrating at a different frequency. We understand it because with the term interdimensional and quantum physics, they've tried to confuse us all this time. You can make this prototype yourselves. It's very labor intensive from a technical point of view because you have to get the worm screws, set them up in a model, and gradually bring them closer until you find that barrier. You'll find it if you do it, but I've made a much easier adaptation since we're in the 21st century and electronics have also advanced a bit. The adaptation I've made is to replace Ferlini's permanent magnetic components with powerful industrial electromagnets. The magnet has a constant and unchanging surrounding magnetic field, and we can vary its intensity. Ferlini did it with the worm screw, moving it closer or further away to find the magnetic barrier. If we have an electromagnet, we can reach the magnetic barrier. How? By applying either more or less voltage or more or less amperage. In the same way, we're going to increase the intensity of the magnetic field variably. This is an adaptation I've made, and instead of facing them, working in a group of 4, just as Ferlini did, we have chosen the hexagon, arranged like this. 6 electromagnets, each with its own coils, arranged in 3 groups of 2, connected in parallel. I'm not going to go into the technical setup, but this isn't hard to do. Another variation is to angle the electromagnets downwards between 30 and 45 degrees, because that way the point of convergence is at its maximum. From the point of view of achieving the highest density, in this case of an electromagnetic field. This project can be done just the same. In fact, it's even easier, although making the electromagnets with ferrite cores is a bit more work to make them as efficient as possible. A 12-volt, 10-amp battery is all you need, nothing more. And sure enough, the famous mist appears, which at first would be that dissociation of matter that Ferlini talked about. If you notice, except that CERN has 8, this is already looking a lot like CERN. I'm going to share a photo of what the core looks like, and you'll understand it perfectly. You're seeing here the 8. In this case, it's an octagon. The 8 bars that converge towards the center are 8 electromagnets, and they're arranged at an angle between 30 and 45 degrees, pointing towards the center. What we have right in the center, we'll see later what it is. That's a sigil. Well, I just wanted to show you the image so you get an idea of how much coincidence there is with Hugo Ferlini. When developing the concept of the magnetic barrier and the interpretations he gave, in terms of particle acceleration, for example, he spoke about space-time distortion and also about reaching incredible speeds. Those are all the concepts that appear at CERN, precisely. Antimatter, dark matter, all right? You might be wondering at first, well, what does this story Ricardo's telling me here about a 19th century Italian scientist have to do with anything? It might be more or less interesting in relation to the research we're carrying out at the moment. Even though it's connected to CERN, you'll soon find out why. Now, without losing sight of everything we've discussed at the start about Ferlini and the magnetic barrier, I'm going to talk to you a bit about wave dynamics, the concept of frequency and resonance. There's something here that's essential. You need to know that all objects, in fact, everything that exists in nature, right? I'll write here matter, which is essentially energy, but organized. The densest form of organized energy is matter. All objects, matter, as I said, including those found in nature, have the ability at their very core, which is another way of saying it's inherent to them to vibrate and resonate. And you might ask, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that chalk resonates at a certain frequency. Later on, we'll look at what characteristics chalk has that make it resonate at a particular frequency. That the computer mouse has a certain frequency. That this has a certain frequency. That it's a cough. That a glass or crystal tumbler has a certain frequency at which it will resonate. In this sense, when introducing resonance, there is a fundamental key element, which is what we call frequency. Consider frequency in electromagnetic terms across the whole extensive range of the spectrum, which activates them, which activates those objects. To activate the object in this case would be to cause it to vibrate and resonate. So far, we haven't said anything particularly new, nothing that we don't already know in terms of the behavior of acoustic sound waves, as you know. Consider, for example, that if we have right here a standard tuning fork that resonates at a specific frequency of exactly 440 Hz, and if you then play a matching note on the acoustic piano at that same 440 Hz, this tuning fork will automatically start to vibrate in sympathy, or in other words, it will begin to resonate. From the scientific point of view of the acoustic spectrum, it is actually very easy to see and clearly verify the physical concept of resonance. Isn't it a fascinating thing to observe? But that also happens in the other spectrum of electromagnetic waves that we can't see. So how do we notice when a circuit, for example, goes into resonance? We're going to see that as well. When we talk here about making matter vibrate, in a way, it's even about being able to organize it. If matter were dust and had low density or little mass, it could even be arranged in a certain geometric shape. This is what's known as cymatics. But if the object is larger, so it really depends on its mass, and the signal were enormous, we could even break this object. Like when a soprano sings a certain musical note and can make a glass vibrate and shatter, right? Therefore, a specific frequency, looking at it the other way round, means that every distinct form of physical matter has a unique frequency that activates it. And the reverse is also true. It functions as a bidirectional relationship. In other words, a specific or particular frequency serves to organize and structure that specific object, that matter, we might say. Just as a specific frequency organizes that matter is also organized by a specific frequency. It works both ways. This is essential for understanding our reality and how nature is arranged, which we see every day. This is actually what is known in physics as the concept of a spectral signature. That is to say, within the entire electromagnetic spectrum, there is a specific frequency that is its signature, the one that activates that object or causes it to resonate. Or in other words, an object with a certain shape and form can be activated by that same frequency. Only one key works, opens that door. Only one key, a specific and particular frequency, opens a door. And there, since there is only a one-to-one application, the concept of signature appears. Signature as identity. Signature as identity, sigil as signature. All of this is very interesting. We've talked about the concept of resonance, when a material starts to resonate, starts to vibrate at a certain frequency. How do we use that ourselves? Well, what does the resonance of an object depend on? Which, after all, is matter, right? What does it depend on? Well, basically on three components. The first thing we must consider is its specific composition. That is, exactly what kind of material it is made of, right? Please keep this crucial point in mind, because the specific material that objects are constructed from will play a massive role. It is a decisive factor in the phenomenon of resonance, one of the most absolutely decisive and fundamental factors, in fact, that determines how an object vibrates. This happens, as you may know and will see later, precisely with the 72 sigils of the Ars Goetia. Each of them was organized into hierarchies of princes, dukes, within the infernal hierarchy scales, I'm telling you. But each one of them had a metal associated with it. See how the same parallel appears here. You'll see for yourself later. 2. Furthermore, it also depends on its size, because we naturally need a stronger or perhaps a weaker signal to make an object vibrate or resonate, depending on its specific size or its total mass. It's a concept purely derived from the previous ones. And the third point to consider, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, is the specific nature of its geometry or shape. That is to say, the fact that a particular object vibrates at a certain frequency will depend above all on this, its geometry or shape and the composition of what it's made of. The size will affect how much we need to increase or decrease the intensity of the signal for it to start vibrating, or to reach full vibration, so to speak. Do you realize, for example, I'll tell you in advance, that sigils are specified to be made from certain materials, especially metal, like copper? Gold for princes, silver for dukes, in that infernal hierarchy, and they have a specific size or mass, and a very particular geometry or geometric pattern, which we are now going to study a bit more closely. To put it quite simply, sigils are the metaphorical door or the intricate lock, probably a unique spectral signature pattern in terms of physics, and vibrational resonance, or rather frequency, is the essential key. In the past, in rituals, the key or the concept of resonance was applied through what we've seen here, acoustic waves. The rhythmic chanting of a certain song, even when carefully modulated with the harmony of different frequencies at a specific tone held over time, was traditionally employed to make the sigil vibrate and resonate. Nowadays, a Gregorian chant is no longer necessary, held over time. We're going to talk about electromagnetic frequencies and sigils as electronic circuits. But the operation and the principle are exactly the same, which is why I want you all to understand this, because if you don't, you won't reach the same conclusions that I did. Here is a very important note to consider. When matter begins to resonate, what is the underlying reason for that phenomenon? It has been subjected to the influence of the specific frequency, the precise harmonic key that unlocks that specific lock or door. In this case, the matter, which could be the sigil, itself becomes into what we now recognize in our modern technical terms as a sophisticated and powerful transmitting antenna. It could even transmit that tuning fork, which is now resonating with a signal, to nearby tuning forks on the same wavelength, the same frequency. How do we know from a physical point of view that a particular object has entered into resonance? And the signal we send isn't necessarily acoustic, but rather through electromagnetic waves. Well, there are three main characteristics, these three. And here, one of the mysteries that you all know very well is resolved too. The first is the appearance of mist, which is probably the ionization of the environment, as it's called in modern physics, but which is actually the dissociation from the organizational point of view of matter, the loss of cohesion of those atoms Ferlin was talking about. The sudden appearance of mist, you can easily check this for yourselves, is accompanied by a buzzing sound from an acoustic point of view, occurring as a direct consequence of the convergence of electromagnetic fields. This phenomenon is the famous D-hum, which is the specific hum that can be clearly heard at the stratospheric level. And one more significant factor to consider is the phenomenon known as ionic wind. It's a kind of gust produced when powerful electromagnetic fields come into contact. Ionic wind, these are terms from physics. This is also surely responsible for many of the wind currents we experience, whose origins are unknown, and so on. But anyway, for now, we'll leave it there. If we compare these terms we're discussing with the concept of the sigil, we can certainly conclude that indeed this sigil functions as a sophisticated lock, and if we were to use a high precision frequency generator, which I will place right here for you to see, it is one of those specific types of devices that are designed to emit a range of frequencies, starting at the very bottom, for example, from 1 Hertz, and extending all the way to 150,000 Hertz, right? Well, it would be a bit like the electronic signal generator, a small metal keyring with 150,000 keys, right? In this case. But out of all those keys, there is surely one, maybe several due to the harmonics, that are important. Perhaps there is one that is the universal master key, the one that opens this lock. In this case, as I was saying, the sigil acts as a sophisticated electronic circuit, and instead of the ritual chant that was used in the past, we have a signal generator. For example, this one here. These are very cheap, which is quite affordable. For instance, this one is sold on Amazon for 11 or 12 euros, and it generates signals between 1 Hertz and 150 kilohertz in a square wave. Here we can see the connections, right? A fractal antenna, I'll put it here. This is an antenna that uses a complex geometric composition. This is a specialized antenna system that utilizes a composition made up of several distinct and integrated elements. A remarkably similar structural design that continuously repeats itself at many different scales. An antenna that utilizes a fundamental base composition, and from there, its intricate design is repeated at several different scales. For example, you might have seen this if you've ever opened up an electronic device and are into electronics. You might have seen antennas with a printed rectangular shape, and now inside that rectangle, there's another rectangle, and inside that one, there's yet another, and another, and another, right? At least a great variety of rectangles. Well, what this achieves is that not only is a specific frequency emitted, but also the harmonics of that entire frequency are cast. In other words, when a specific resonance frequency is emitted, the sweep spectrum is much broader. It's understood that if this is done individually, let's say that from the whole range of the spectrum, an individual antenna is going to open a lock with a specific key, which is the frequency, and with a fractal antenna, such as graphene plasmonic antennas, the frequency sweep is much broader, and it will enable or trigger a sort of Hall effect. At different stations, you can imagine all of this like a radio station. Here you have FM. A conventional antenna would pick up one station, whereas a fractal antenna would be able to take in all the harmonics, sweep a much wider frequency range, and pick up almost all of them, which is in fact what is used, right? It is important to keep firmly in mind the complex concept of a fractal antenna, because this is going to start looking more and more like a mystical sigil. We will examine and study all of its intricate details a bit later on. Of course, as a matter of fact, if you also, in that specific configuration, for example, with the rectangles I drew earlier, maintain the Fibonacci sequence, or even easier, the golden ratio, which is the irrational number phi equal to approximately 1.61803. And this is a constant in all sacred geometries, in the construction of all temples. For example, they make it so that this square, when its area is multiplied by 1.618, equals the area of this one here. This one here, you multiply its area, which is base times height, by 1.618, and you get the next one. Therefore, you're effectively following a Fibonacci sequence in terms of the areas of the rectangles. Well, the fact of introducing this significantly modifies and simplifies the electromagnetic chestband. That is to say, the sweep is now considerably more extensive. It's as if it were directly connected with nature, like with the creator. So everything you do with that proportion, including in sacred geometry, the construction of temples, where you keep those proportions in patterns that you repeat, like arches, like columns, even columns at another scale, but still maintaining this proportion, means that at a certain frequency, base or seed, the building, the temple, resonates specifically and connects with something that was exactly what they intended. But let me also add that in those ancient temples, most of the massive stone constructions were made of solid granite, or a combination of granite and natural quartz were frequently used together. When you meticulously maintain that material organized with a highly specific and intricate pattern and a carefully calculated and precise measurement, it is almost as if you have a vast amount of energy in a passive state, patiently waiting to be fully activated by a certain resonant frequency. But if, in addition, the columns are made of granite and quartz, which is what was typically used, for example, in Hitler Dome pyramids, both materials are piezoelectric, which means that under specific types of physical pressure, including some types of waves, even acoustic ones, they can successfully produce and generate electricity or some other type of energy that can be efficiently converted for use. An interesting fact, because what we're seeing here is ancient technology, which doesn't necessarily have to be behind us, in the sense that we're now going to examine and explore what we call sigils. And you have in mind this image I'm going to show here. I'm going to put up the sigils from the Ars Goetia, the renowned and widely recognized 72 signatures or fractal antennas, if you want to see them that way, of each of those supernatural entities and intelligences. Demons, here they are, right? Those are the sigils. As we already saw in the previous episode, number 12, many of them resemble the printed boards of an electronic circuit on a fiberglass or bakelite base, especially for those of us who are electronics enthusiasts, for example, this one here. Now, let's look at a very curious fact, which I'll tell you about in a moment. In that sense, the sigil is certainly not, as we have all been led to believe, a truly ancient and mystical symbolic representation. It's not a mystical symbol, right, innit? A complete functional electrical circuit, not an electronic wire, with a certain specific geometry. But furthermore, as you know, the lesser key of Solomon's Ars Goetia states each of the 72 demons has a sigil and often a spiritual metal for their invocation. Has a specific composition, right? In this case, it's a metal. For example, as it says somewhere, gold is associated with entities of higher demonic hierarchy, those of higher rank, like presidents and so on. Bronze, especially, is used for making certain vessels, such as Solomon's vessel. And it was a specific composition. They have a particular size or mass, a specific one. And above all, they have a geometric pattern, which, according to the theory or what myth and legend, call it what you will, have passed down to us from Solomon, would be the identity signature of that geometric intelligence, which he compelled them to imprint. They have a geometric pattern. Do you remember a little bit earlier when we were discussing the concept of resonance? And I mentioned that we could know, or that resonance specifically and primarily depended on three very specific factors. I told you that resonance depended on the composition of the material. I told you that it primarily depended upon the shape or size they had, on the size or the mass, as you will likely remember. And I said that most importantly of all, the geometry was what would ultimately determine the final resonance. It's not the same for an object to have a hexagonal shape as it is to have a cylindrical or a square one. You'll see, for example, that in the symbolism of the Ars Goetia, where they apparently appear to be demonic sigils, orthogonality appears a lot, that is, straight lines. Normally, although some are indeed symmetrical, there is a certain symmetry. However, in sigils that apparently belong to the forces of order, or agents not of good but of order, symbols or sigils appear, and their sigils are precisely perfectly harmonious. A pentagram, and within the pentagram, a hexagram, but everything is in terms of perfect symmetry and harmony at the geometric level. It's curious. For now, it's just curious. Have you noticed that each sigil is governed by a specific metal? Gold, copper, silver, tin. We can interpret it in the same way. Of course, this is not a mystical symbol. That's just what they've made you believe over time. That is a symbol. A sigil, really? This device is a complex fractal antenna, please try to remember that specific term, carefully designed or meticulously engineered if we are specifically talking about the sigil or the antenna, which are essentially the exact same thing, in order to effectively couple two phases between, not between two, I'm going to say between two worlds and I'll write it down, but it's not really about two worlds. It's about two vibrational states within the same world. I'm going to put it like this, with that perception of what I've just said. When we talk about two phases here, you can imagine what we're referring to. We're talking about the phase, ours, the real world, human beings, who are also part of this as energy and dense matter with a specific vibrational state. And the other phase, what is it? The other phase is the E factor. But they don't come from another world, they're in the same one. That's why I said you have to be careful. I've spoken of different worlds so you can understand the perception, but in reality, it's the same world with different frequency states. Here, in two phases, you could interpret it in physics terms as matter, where we are, and antimatter, or dark matter. These aren't terms I've come up with. When I refer to dark, the second phase in the E factor, well, you can imagine what CERN is actually looking for. So look, let's share a screen so you can understand. From the Higgs boson, which is the famous God particle, to dark matter. CERN's challenges for the coming years: to find dark matter. It's not the same as what we're talking about here. They don't realize it's the same principle with the magnetic barrier. The same hexagonal or octagonal arrangement is used to find that magnetic barrier, or 0 point that Ferlini referred to. We could say that the sigil, when I mentioned the sigil, you remember this here. They really do look like circuits. So we could say that the sigil is the physical representation. And of course, this is incredibly important to understand, the specific resonance frequency itself is actually the fundamental underlying pattern that governs the entire system. You remember when we sprinkle talcum powder, very fine sand, or tiny grains of salt on a smooth circular glass surface and make it vibrate at a specific resonant frequency from an acoustic point of view? Those geometric shapes would form, which are part of what has come to be known as cymatics. Well, the sigil serves as the physical representation and symbolic gateway, that intricate geometric pattern which manifests the unique resonance frequency or specific calling effect of a particular intelligence, such as a specific demon, acting as a precise vibrational signature for communication. Someone might say here, Ricardo, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to summon a demon? God forbid, if anything, to look her away. But not at all. What I want is to understand how it works and what is really being done behind humanity's back with this knowledge of sacred geometries, Ferlini's magnetic barrier, ancient sigils, and so on. The sigil is its geometric pattern. That is to say, when it is called upon, the signature that appears, the pattern that shows up, is the sigil of Astar or Baal, or one of those you are seeing on screen. It is, in fact, their signature, just like the signature you might use when autographing something or signing any document, or rather, their digital signature. Do you understand now why each of us is going to have a digital signature and what it will actually refer to, what it will really be associated with? Probably one of those sigils you just seen there. In a sigil, just like in an electronic circuit, exactly the same. As we saw in the previous program, the similarities of where they might come from, how the School of Engineers, so to speak, standardized all the symbolism, where those people started from, what connection they have with the world of Freemasonry. Ultimately, in a sigil, we basically have two types of points. We have two elements, let's say. On the one hand, individual nodes that are visually represented by a perfect circle. If you've seen them, you've seen lots of circles, right? Those points are the fixed endpoints of the wave, and all of the remaining parts we can categorize as antinodes. They can be straight lines with different variations. They can look like coils. In the same way, from this point of view, we have two antinode elements. So in the same way, we have nodes, which are the specific connection points where the components are carefully soldered together, what we call the electrode, and antinodes. Is that correct? These can be coils, or they can be the tracks themselves, which are usually straight. The layout is the same. Have you noticed, for example, in what you're seeing here, that in every place where the famous Latin cross floor plan appears from the perspective of sacred geometry, or the inverted cross, for example, here, there is always a connection node where if the current were to pass through, for example, here in this one, it would end up at the cross in an inverted form. Don't you notice this? Look, it's the same here. Here you have a cross-shaped symbol that is shown to be inverted in the direction of the node where the electrical current would enter, down here in this one. The same applies here as well. Here, the current enters and it becomes inverted in this direction. Same here. Same here. Same here. Can you see? Do you know what I mean by this? The concept of the inverted cross isn't about turning the cross upside down to go against Christ, as we've been led to believe. This has something to do with that geometry, with geometric patterns with its signature. It's another matter entirely if they used the cross and turned it upside down however they wanted when crucifying Jesus. That's a different thing altogether. You have to bear in mind that in an electronic circuit or in a sigil, if I were to make a current pass through it, and most of them are closed circuits, as you'll notice. If, for example, I have the nodes here, and here I have certain circuits that do this, here an inverted cross, whatever you like. And if I make an electric current pass through it, it's precisely at the nodes where the greatest mass or accumulation of energy will be found. From an electromagnetic point of view, if this were a fractal antenna, the area with the most vortex, magnetically speaking, would be at the nodes. If we could see the direction of an electromagnetic field when a current passes through here, and if this were a fractal antenna, the place where the energy is most concentrated is precisely here. This is basic geometry in fractal antennas. That's why graphene plasmonic antennas require a specific scale, shape, and the material, graphene. And at the antinodes, the distribution is much better, right? Let's say these are the focal points of concentration. Another thing you should know is that, for example, if the nodes were distributed according to their Fibonacci sequence, for instance, keeping a distance of 1 to 1, 2, then 4, then 8, if the circuit were larger or at different scales, Now the energy doesn't concentrate here, but instead what it does is form a toroid from a magnetic point of view. I'm going to remove the Latin cross floor plan since you can't see it from the board. Fibonacci, I'm going to tell you that you start from an initial seed, which is 1, then you add another one, and now you start adding 1 plus 1, 2, 1 plus 2, 3, 2 plus 3, 5, 3 plus 5, 8, 5 plus 8, 13, and so on. And you might ask, what does this have to do with the golden ratio, which is phi, the number phi, 1.618, and it appears in most natural distributions. It appears in the shell of a turtle. It appears in the arrangement of a beehive. It appears, of course, in the construction of sacred temples because they knew these universal laws, or a kind of harmonic frequency in the branching of stems. It's as if nature had chosen the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio to reveal the outcome of creation. It's also related to the number pi externally, but for now we're going to set that aside. If you notice, if we keep dividing this number by the previous one, we'll get closer and closer to the Fibonacci situation. For example, 1 divided by 1 gives us 1. 2 divided by 1 gives us 1.5. 3 divided by 2 also gives us 1.5. 5 divided by 3 is already close to 1.6. 8 divided by 5 is 1.616 something or other. 13 divided by 8 is 1.617. In other words, we keep getting closer so that the limit of the Fibonacci sequence is precisely the golden ratio. And why do we do this? Because maybe I can't represent the golden ratio in a circuit, but I can represent the Fibonacci sequence, which is the same thing, right? Oh, I can't represent it in a circuit, I can't represent it in a temple, but I can represent the Fibonacci sequence. One, let's say, is the result of the other. Well, what I've done with this, or what I'm trying to do, once you'll more or less know all the concepts we've covered here, is to bring together all the concepts, just like CERN has done. That is to say, it's a kind of CERN, but with a different goal, a home laboratory, but with enough power to generate a similar result. You don't need as much brute force as CERN. What you need is the seal, the specific sigil. What I've done is bring together the following concepts. A device, as I've already mentioned, where I found the magnetic barrier, in this case arranged in hexagrams, all right? Electromagnets, which are these here. We've already said that the electromagnets, I'm not going to talk about how they're made, but they actually use a double ferrite core with pointed ends, like those at CERN. I mean, not because I was inspired by CERN, but because physics tells us that when they're pointed, the magnetic fields are directed more towards the center. Electromagnetic. A power supply, which is a battery with a positive and negative terminal of 12 volts and 10 amps. You don't need more than that because with larger circuits or a higher current, we can have problems in the circuit. Each of these has its own terminals, and as we've said, we're going to connect them in series in groups of 2. Some of you might be copying the circuit. I'm not going to include all the surrounding components that are behind it, like the introduction of diodes to saturate the current flow in one direction, the MOSFET that will amplify a signal generator, or how to power the stealth circuit. I'm not going to include that because really it would just make things more complicated. Once you've activated the electromagnets, and here in the center, I'll erase the connection so you can visualize the internal layout more clearly. Even the hexagonal arrangement is just to show this geometric structure. Right in the center is where the mystical sigil is carefully positioned, placed on a precision-engineered fiberglass board where the corresponding sigil is drawn. It doesn't necessarily have to be demonic in nature, all right? The signature, the geometric pattern. So we're going to induce an electric current in a circuit with copper tracks. Here in the middle, we're going to generate the famous Ferlini barrier and connect a frequency generator. The live wire, the group of electromagnets, and the end goes elsewhere. In short, the sigil is crossed by the electric current with certain protective elements. The electromagnets generate the Ferlini magnetic barrier for me, and this distortion, and the signal generator, which is this one here. What it does is a frequency sweep that enters the sigil. So one of those frequencies will be the one that activates it, or opens it, or manifests it, evokes it, invokes it, calls it, however you want to see it. So this essentially implies that if it really is a sentient intelligence, it will actively utilize the magnetic barrier, or that mist, not only to physically manifest its presence, what we're currently seeing in Solomon's vessels, not just to manifest itself, but also to try to bind together various elements of matter and successfully construct that physical suit, that protective casing, that tangible manifestation. The scientific experiment consists of carefully sprinkling, right on top of this surface where a clear glass is placed, tiny microscopic microparticles. I'm explaining this in very general terms because I still need to develop it further, although half of it is already done. Microparticles of graphite, which is something very similar to graphene. On a nano scale, what you're seeing here is a little bit more complicated, the circuit, but I've got this about 95% completed, and it's mad. But anyway, as I say, in my project, I'll know what I have to do with it, or what I shouldn't do. And I mainly want to show it so that you know what they're doing at CERN. In fact, with those graphite microparticles, or graphene at the nanoscale, like the kind that's sprayed aerially, what we're really doing is giving that intelligence, which they're going to attract in this way, the ability to manifest itself in a spectacular way in reality. We're going to make it so it can put on its suit. Another thing is that the side effect of that spraying is that it rains on us, etc., which people aren't interested in. Electric magnetic fields and water don't get along well, except that under certain conditions, they can amplify each other. Ultimately, this is what they've called the Blue Beam Project. If I spray the atmosphere with a material that has magnetic properties, and there is something, let's just say something, that can make it cohere and take shape, then I would have turned the sky, the stratosphere, the atmosphere, what we're going to see, into a kind of screen, right? Where I can project absolutely anything that I might desire, but also as a self-assembled signal within biology, using that material, let us refer to it as the ink, which will later systematically organize itself according to a certain pattern and measurement, whether in a sigil or something similar. It will vibrate at the same resonant frequency as that other intelligence. Therefore, what will happen is that everyone will see the same thing. Isn't that what they tell us? Everyone will see their sins. Everyone will see the same thing. What they will perceive are the profound sensations of that intelligence that manifests itself clearly, all at once. And we've extensively studied this in the Forbidden Zone with Jose Luis. Do you know what I mean? Every eye will see it, of course, half of humanity or more. It is implanted with a material that will self-organize within the biology, like ink. And we will all see the same thing, because by being hybridized, I hope not, but those people by being hybrid will perceive the sensations and thoughts of the intelligence that acts as the main core, above all else. This is the concept. You can see it as a hive mind, but not in terms of artificial intelligence. The hive in the sense that the same self-assembling sigil has been introduced into the entire population, which is that ink that will self-organize into a series of geometric patterns to form a fractal antenna, precisely with this intelligence that is going to manifest. I know much more, but I can't share it in this live stream because it's hard to take in. I understand that this is hard to take in. It's not something out of this world, but not everyone knows. In terms of electricity or electronics, even at a basic level, and not everyone has the ability to separate some ideas from others. There's an image I'm going to talk about, which is this one here. This could be considered what is the CERN sigil. Those of you who are skilled with artificial intelligence and so on, you can take this image I'm about to show you and compare it with some of the famous sigils, whether from the web teas or anywhere else, to see which one it most closely resembles. This is what appears right at the center of the core of CERN. Indeed, it's a geometric figure and it has certain rules of symmetry and some resemblance to some of the famous sigils. Anyway, I'll leave this here for your study. I don't want to drag out today's program much longer because we started off talking about Ferlini's magnetic fields, the Ferlini barrier, and we've ended up talking about the project I'm developing. This is what I mean by the personal project. But above all, it's so that you can understand what's happening, which we already knew and still know, but how they're going to put it into practice, or on a deeper level, how they're going to apply it. And along the way, we start to understand how we can see our world from another perspective, which might actually be much more real than the one they've made us see, measuring dimensions on a material level, in terms of vibration and frequency. Because the key lies in vibrational frequency, which is where they will manifest. When they couple the two phases using that Ferlini magnetic barrier, that's when they manifest in our reality. And under certain conditions that can occur, where the brain itself can also generate those conditions. Because bear in mind that the human brain and its ability to generate electrical impulses also produce electromagnetic fields, which under certain circumstances can reach a certain intensity and create a kind of artificial barrier of that rhythm. With this, you might now be left a bit, take it with a pinch of salt. But it's very likely that the trance states they induce themselves, the drugs, and when they touch the head, all of this is ultimately aimed at generating those vibrational states that interest them. And that's when they can manifest themselves much more openly. Of course, making use of your body in this sense. We'll leave it here for now. As I always say, analyze all the information. If there's anything you disagree with, let me know here. Regardless of your knowledge, what we've discussed is science. Our terminology is different. They call it dark matter, we say factors. They call it antimatter, we say factors. Where they talk about electronic circuits or fractal antennas, we talk about sigils. Do we understand each other? So, as I say, put everything in quarantine, question everything, study it, take in what you agree with, and if you don't agree with something, mention it in the chat, and we'll keep moving forward in this direction. This is something I'm interested in. Well, as I said, thank you for everything, for being there, for encouraging me, and we'll keep moving forward. Very good night to you all, and I hope you've enjoyed the program, despite the tediousness of writing on the board and all that. Until next time.
Empower Translations. Translations for all humanity.